Welcome to this episodic audiobook presentation of Sherlock Holmes. In this series, each chapter brings the classic tales to life, unfolding the mystery, atmosphere, and adventure that have captivated readers for generations. Before we begin, a brief note. This presentation of Sherlock Holmes is a modernized retelling of the original canon. The cases remain faithful to the stories that generations have loved, while the language and structure have been carefully refined to create a smoother, more immersive listening experience for today's audience. What you are about to hear is not a change to the mysteries themselves, but a restoration of their flow, allowing the world of Sherlock Holmes to unfold clearly for the modern ear. And now, we open our first case, Book 1, A Study in Scarlet. Chapter 1, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. In 1878, I earned my Doctor of Medicine degree from the University of London and proceeded to Netley to complete the required training for army surgeons. After finishing my studies, I was assigned as assistant surgeon to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers. The regiment was stationed in India, and before I could join them, the Second Afghan War erupted. Upon arriving in Bombay, I discovered that my unit had already advanced through the passes and was deep in enemy territory. I followed, along with many other officers in similar circumstances, and eventually reached Kandahar safely, where I joined my regiment and began my duties. The campaign brought honours and promotions to many, but for me, it was a series of misfortunes and disasters. I was transferred from my brigade to the Berkshires, with whom I served at the ill-fated Battle of Maiwand. There, a Jezail bullet struck my shoulder, shattering the bone and grazing the subclavian artery. I would have fallen into the hands of the ruthless Ghazis if not for the bravery and dedication of Murray, my orderly, who managed to hoist me onto a pack horse and bring me safely back to the British lines. Exhausted by pain and weakened by the prolonged hardships I had endured, I was transported, along with a large number of wounded, to the base hospital at Peshawar. I had managed to rally and was well enough to stroll through the wards and even enjoy a bit of sun on the veranda when enteric fever struck, a relentless scourge of our Indian territories. For months, my survival was in doubt. When I finally regained consciousness and began to recover, I was so frail and wasted that a medical board insisted I be sent back to England without delay. Thus, I was shipped off on the troopship Orontes and arrived a month later at Portsmouth Jetty, my health irreparably damaged, but with the government's blessing to spend the next 9 months trying to restore it. With no family ties in England, I was as unencumbered as the wind, or at least as unencumbered as one can be, on an income of 11 shillings and sixpence a day. Naturally, I drifted to London, that vast cesspool where all the empire's drifters and idlers inevitably converge. I took up residence for a while in a private hotel on the Strand, living a bleak, aimless life and spending my money far more liberally than was wise. My financial situation soon became so dire that I realized I had to either retreat to the countryside or drastically change my lifestyle. Opting for the latter, I resolved to leave the hotel and find a more modest and affordable place to live. On the very day I reached this decision, I was standing at the Criterion bar when someone tapped me on the shoulder. Turning around, I recognized young Stamford, who had been a dresser under me at Bart's. In the vast wilderness of London, the sight of a familiar face is indeed a welcome relief for a lonely soul. In the past, Stamford and I had never been particularly close, but now I greeted him with genuine enthusiasm, and he seemed equally pleased to see me. Caught up in the joy of our unexpected reunion, I invited him to lunch at the Holborn, and we set off together in a hansom cab. "What on earth have you been up to, Watson?" he asked with open curiosity as we navigated the bustling streets of London. "You're as thin as a rail and as tanned as a walnut." I gave him a brief account of my recent adventures, barely finishing by the time we arrived at our destination. "Poor fellow," he said sympathetically, after hearing about my hardships. "What are you doing now?" "I'm looking for a place to stay," I replied, trying to figure out if it's possible to find comfortable lodgings at a reasonable price. "That's interesting," my companion noted. "You're the second person today to mention that to me." "And who was the first?" I inquired. "A guy working in the chemical lab at the hospital," he replied. "He was lamenting this morning because he couldn't find someone to split the cost of some charming rooms he'd discovered, which were beyond his budget." "By Jove!" I exclaimed. "If he's truly looking for someone to share the rooms and the expenses, I'm the perfect candidate. I'd much rather have a roommate than live alone." Young Stamford gave me a curious look over his wineglass. "You haven't met Sherlock Holmes yet," he said. "You might not find him to your liking as a constant companion." "Why? What's wrong with him?" "Oh, I didn't mean there's anything wrong with him. He's just a bit peculiar in his ideas, quite passionate about certain scientific fields. From what I know, he's a decent enough chap." "A medical student, I assume?" I inquired. "No, I have no clue what he's planning to pursue. I believe he's quite knowledgeable in anatomy and is an excellent chemist, but as far as I know, he hasn't enrolled in any formal medical courses. His studies are rather erratic and unconventional, yet he's gathered a wealth of obscure knowledge that would surprise his professors." "Have you never asked him what he's aiming for?" I asked. "No. He's not someone you can easily coax into conversation, though he can be quite talkative when the mood strikes him." "I'd like to meet him," I said. "If I'm going to share a place with someone, I'd prefer a person with quiet, studious habits. I'm not yet strong enough to handle much noise or excitement. I had my fill of both in Afghanistan, enough to last a lifetime. How can I meet this friend of yours?" "He's bound to be at the laboratory," my companion replied. "He either avoids the place for weeks or works there from dawn till dusk. If you'd like, we can drive over together after lunch." "Certainly," I agreed, and the conversation shifted to other topics. As we headed to the hospital after leaving Holborn, Stamford shared a few more details about the gentleman I was considering as a roommate. "Don't blame me if you don't get along with him," he said. "I only know him from occasional encounters in the lab. You suggested this arrangement, so you can't hold me accountable." "If we don't get along, it will be easy enough to part ways," I replied. "It seems to me, Stamford," I added, scrutinizing my companion, "that you have a reason for distancing yourself from this matter. Is this guy's temper really that terrifying, or what's the deal? Don't hold back." "It's tough to put into words," he replied with a chuckle. "Holmes is a bit too scientific for my liking, almost to the point of being unemotional. I can picture him giving a friend a dose of the latest plant-based toxin, not out of spite, mind you, but purely out of curiosity to understand its effects. To be fair, I think he'd try it on himself just as willingly. He seems to have an obsession with precise and exact knowledge. That's commendable. Sure, but it can go too far. When it involves hitting cadavers with a stick in the dissecting room, it takes on a rather odd form." "Hitting cadavers?" "Yes, to see how bruises can form post-mortem. I witnessed it myself." "And yet you say he's not a medical student." "No. Who knows what his studies are really about?" But here we are. and you'll need to form your own impressions of him." As he spoke, we turned down a narrow lane and slipped through a small side door, entering a wing of the sprawling hospital. The place was familiar to me, and I needed no guidance as we climbed the stark stone staircase and walked down the long corridor lined with whitewashed walls and dull-coloured doors. Near the far end, a low arched passage branched off, leading us to the chemical laboratory. This was a high-ceilinged room, cluttered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered throughout, bristling with retorts, test tubes, and small Bunsen burners with their blue flickering flames. Only one student was present, bent over a distant table, absorbed in his work. At the sound of our footsteps, he looked up and leapt to his feet with a cry of joy. "I've found it! I've found it!" he shouted to my companion, rushing toward us with a test tube in hand. "I've discovered a reagent that is precipitated by hemoglobin and nothing else." The delight on his face was as if he had unearthed a gold mine. "Dr. Watson, meet Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Stamford introduced us. "How do you do?" Holmes greeted warmly, shaking my hand with a surprising firmness. "You've been in Afghanistan, I gather." "How could you possibly know that?" I asked, taken aback. "Never mind," he replied with a self-satisfied chuckle. "The matter at hand is hemoglobin. Surely you grasp the importance of my discovery." "It's intriguing from a chemical standpoint, certainly," I replied. "But in practical terms, why, it's the most significant medico-legal breakthrough in years. Don't you see? It provides an unfailing test for bloodstains. Come, have a look." He eagerly pulled me by the sleeve over to the table where he was working. "Let's have some fresh blood," he said, pricking his finger with a long needle and collecting the drop in a pipette. Now, I add this tiny amount of blood to a litre of water. You see, the mixture looks just like pure water. The blood concentration is no more than 1 in a million. Yet I'm confident we can still detect the characteristic reaction. As he spoke, he tossed a few white crystals into the vessel, then added several drops of a clear liquid. Instantly, the mixture turned a dull mahogany colour, and a brownish sediment settled at the bottom of the glass jar. "Ah, ah!" he exclaimed, clapping his hands with the glee of a child discovering a new toy. "What do you make of that?" "It seems to be a very refined test," I observed. "Exquisite, exquisite." The old Xiaocum test was crude and unreliable. The microscopic examination for blood corpuscles is just as flawed. It's useless if the stains are more than a few hours old. But this test seems effective whether the blood is fresh or aged. Had this been invented earlier, countless men walking free today would have long since faced justice for their crimes. "Indeed," I murmured. Criminal cases often pivot on that single issue. A man might be suspected of a crime months after it occurred. His clothing is scrutinized, and brownish stains are found on them. Are they blood stains, mud stains, rust stains, or perhaps fruit stains? What exactly are they? This question has baffled many experts, and why? Because there was no dependable test. But now we have the Sherlock Holmes test, and such mysteries will no longer pose a problem. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he spoke, placing a hand over his heart and bowing as if acknowledging an imaginary audience's applause. "Congratulations are in order," I said, genuinely taken aback by his enthusiasm. "Consider the case of von Bischoff in Frankfurt last year. He would have certainly faced execution if this test had been available. Then there was Mason from Bradford, the infamous Muller, Lefebvre from Montpellier, and Sampson from New Orleans. I could list dozens of cases where it would have been definitive. You seem like a living almanac of crime, Stamford chuckled. You could start a publication along those lines. Call it the Police Chronicles of Yesteryear. It could make for quite fascinating reading, Sherlock Holmes remarked, applying a small piece of plaster over a prick on his finger. I must be cautious, he continued, turning to me with a smile, as I often experiment with poisons. He extended his hand as he spoke, and I noticed it was covered with similar plasters and stained with strong acids. We're here on business, Stamford said, settling onto a tall three-legged stool and nudging another toward me with his foot. My friend here is looking for a place to stay. And since you mentioned you couldn't find anyone to share with, I thought it best to introduce you two. Sherlock Holmes seemed quite pleased with the prospect of sharing his space with me. I've got my eye on a suite in Baker Street, he said, which would suit us perfectly. You don't mind the smell of strong tobacco, do you? I smoke ships myself, I replied. That's good to hear. I usually have chemicals around and occasionally conduct experiments. Would that bother you? Not at all. Let me think. What else might be an issue? I get into moods sometimes and might not speak for days. Don't assume I'm being unfriendly when that happens. Just leave me be, and I'll come around. Now, what about you? It's best for two people to know each other's quirks before they start living together. I chuckled at the interrogation. I have a bullpup, I said, and I avoid conflicts because my nerves are frayed. I wake up at all sorts of ungodly hours, and frankly, I'm incredibly lazy. When I'm in better health, I have a different set of vices, but those are the main ones for now. Do you count violin playing among the disturbances you dislike? He asked with a hint of concern. It depends on who's playing, I replied. A well-played violin is divine. A poorly played one, however. Oh, that's fine, he interrupted with a cheerful laugh. I think we can consider the matter settled, assuming the rooms suit you. When can we see them? Meet me here at noon tomorrow, and we'll go together to finalize everything, he said. Agreed. Noon sharp, I replied, shaking his hand. We left him engrossed in his chemical experiments and walked together toward my hotel. By the way, I asked suddenly, stopping and turning to Stamford, how on earth did he know I came from Afghanistan? My companion gave a mysterious smile. That's just one of his quirks, he said. A lot of people are curious about how he figures things out. Oh, a mystery, is it? I exclaimed, rubbing my hands together with anticipation. This is quite intriguing. I must thank you for bringing us together. As they say, the proper study of mankind is man. Then you must study him, Stamford replied as he took his leave. You'll find him a tough puzzle, though. I bet he'll learn more about you than you will about him. Goodbye. Goodbye, I replied, and continued on to my hotel, feeling quite intrigued by my new acquaintance. In the previous chapter, Dr. John Watson recounts the events that brought him back to England after war, injury, and illness. Alone in London and short on means, he begins searching for affordable lodgings. A chance meeting with an old acquaintance introduces him to an unusual figure, a brilliant, eccentric man working in a hospital laboratory. That man is Sherlock Holmes. Their first encounter reveals Holmes's extraordinary powers of observation, his passion for science, and a mind already immersed in the study of crime. Before the day ends, Watson finds himself considering not only a new place to live, but a new companion, one whose habits and intellect promise mystery, curiosity, and unforeseen adventure. In this chapter, their strange new association begins to take shape. Book 1. A Study in Scarlet. Chapter 2. The Science of Deduction. We met the next day as planned and went to see the rooms at 221B Baker Street, which he had mentioned during our meeting. The place comprised 2 cozy bedrooms and a large, airy sitting room, cheerfully furnished and lit by 2 wide windows. The apartments were so appealing in every respect, and the terms seemed so reasonable when split between us, that we sealed the deal on the spot and immediately took possession. That very evening I moved my belongings from the hotel, and the following morning Sherlock Holmes arrived with several boxes and suitcases. For a day or two, we were occupied with unpacking and arranging our things to best suit the space. Once that was done, we gradually began to settle in and adapt to our new environment. Holmes was certainly an easy man to live with. He was quiet in his manner, and his routines were consistent. It was uncommon for him to be awake past 10 at night, and he always had breakfast and left the house before I even got up in the morning. Some days he would spend his time at the chemical lab, other days in the dissecting rooms, and occasionally he would embark on long walks that seemed to lead him into the most impoverished areas of the city. His energy was unmatched when he was in the throes of work. Yet there were times when a lethargy would overcome him, and for days he would lie on the sofa in the sitting room, barely speaking or moving from morning till night. During these periods, I noticed such a distant, vacant look in his eyes that I might have suspected him of indulging in narcotics, if not for the temperance and cleanliness that characterized his entire lifestyle, which dismissed such a thought. As the weeks passed, my interest in him and curiosity about his life's purpose grew steadily. His very presence and appearance were enough to catch the eye of even the most indifferent passer-by. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, and his extreme leanness made him appear even taller. His eyes were sharp and penetrating, except during those spells of lethargy I mentioned, and his thin, hawk-like nose lent his expression an air of alertness and decisiveness. His chin was prominent and square, a feature that often signifies determination. His hands were perpetually ink-stained and marked with chemicals, yet he possessed an extraordinary delicacy of touch, which I frequently observed when he handled his delicate philosophical instruments. You might think me an incorrigible meddler when I admit how much this man piqued my curiosity, and how often I tried to penetrate the veil of silence he maintained about his personal affairs. But before you judge, consider how aimless my life was, with so little to capture my interest. My health kept me indoors unless the weather was exceptionally mild, and I had no friends to break the monotony of my daily routine. In such circumstances, I eagerly embraced the small mystery surrounding my companion and devoted much of my time to trying to unravel it. He wasn't studying medicine. He had confirmed Stamford's opinion on that matter when I asked, nor did he seem to be pursuing any academic path that might lead to a degree in science or any other recognized gateway into the scholarly world. Yet his passion for certain subjects was remarkable, and within his peculiar range, his knowledge was so extraordinarily detailed and extensive that his insights often left me astonished. Surely no one would work so diligently or acquire such precise information without a specific goal in mind. Casual readers rarely exhibit such precision in their learning. No one fills their mind with trivial details without a compelling reason. His ignorance was as striking as his knowledge. In the realms of modern literature, philosophy, and politics, he seemed to know almost nothing. When I mentioned Thomas Carlyle, he innocently asked who that was and what he had accomplished. My astonishment peaked when I discovered he was unaware of the Copernican theory and the structure of the solar system. The idea that any educated person in this 19th century could be oblivious to the fact that the Earth orbits the Sun was so extraordinary to me that I struggled to comprehend it. "You seem surprised," he remarked, smiling at my astonished look. "Now that I know it, I'll make an effort to forget it." "To forget it?" I exclaimed. "You see," he explained, "I believe a man's brain is like a small empty attic, and you must furnish it with the items you choose. A fool fills it with all sorts of clutter he encounters, so the useful knowledge gets crowded out, or at best, mixed up with so many other things that it's hard to retrieve. The skilled craftsman, however, is very selective about what he allows into his brain attic. He keeps only the tools that will aid him in his work, but he has a wide variety of those, all in perfect order. It's a mistake to think that little room has elastic walls and can expand indefinitely. Trust me, there comes a point when for every new piece of knowledge, you forget something you previously knew. It is crucial then to ensure that trivial facts don't crowd out the essential ones." "But what about the solar system?" I objected. "What does it matter to me?" he cut in, clearly irritated. "You say we orbit the Sun. If we orbited the Moon instead, it wouldn't make the slightest difference to me or my work." I almost asked him what exactly his work entailed, but something in his demeanor warned me that such a question would not be well received. Still, I mulled over our brief exchange, trying to draw conclusions from it. He had stated he would only learn what was relevant to his purpose. Thus, all his knowledge was tailored to be of use to him. I mentally listed the areas where he had demonstrated exceptional expertise. I even took a pencil and noted them down. I couldn't help but chuckle at the list once it was finished. It read as follows: Sherlock Holmes, his boundaries. 1. Knowledge of literature, none. 2. Philosophy, none. 3. Astronomy, none. 4. Politics, weak. 5. Botany, inconsistent, well-versed in belladonna, opium, and poisons in general, lacks any skill in practical gardening. 6. Geology, practical yet limited, can instantly distinguish different soils. After walks, he has shown me stains on his trousers and identified their origin by colour and texture, pinpointing exactly where in London he acquired them. 7. Chemistry, profound. 8. Anatomy, precise but disorganized. 9. Sensational literature, vast. He seems to know every detail of every atrocity committed in the century. 10. Plays the violin skillfully. 11. Is an expert in single-stick, boxing and swordsmanship. 12. Has a solid practical understanding of British law. After compiling this list, I tossed it into the fire in frustration. If I can only figure out what he's aiming for by reconciling all these skills and finding a profession that requires them all, I thought to myself, I might as well abandon the attempt entirely. I mentioned earlier his skill with the violin, which was indeed extraordinary, though as unconventional as his other talents. I knew he could handle complex pieces, having heard him play some of Mendelssohn's Lieder and other favourites at my request. Yet, when left to his own devices, he rarely played recognisable tunes. Instead, he would recline in his armchair in the evenings, eyes closed, and absent-mindedly draw the bow across the violin resting on his knee. The sounds he produced varied, sometimes deep and mournful, other times whimsical and bright. These melodies seemed to mirror his inner musings, though whether the music inspired his thoughts or was merely a product of his whims was beyond my understanding. I might have found these impromptu performances trying if he didn't usually conclude them by playing a rapid succession of my favorite tunes, as if to make amends for testing my patience. In the first week or so, we had no visitors, and I began to suspect that my companion was as solitary as I was. However, I soon discovered he had a wide circle of acquaintances from various walks of life. One frequent visitor was a small, sallow man with a rat-like face and dark eyes, introduced to me as Mr. Lestrade, who appeared 3 or 4 times in a single week. One morning, a young woman arrived, impeccably dressed, and lingered for over half an hour. Later that afternoon, an older man with greying hair, looking rather shabby and resembling a Jewish peddler, visited. He seemed quite agitated and was soon followed by an elderly woman in disarray. On another occasion, an elderly gentleman with white hair met with my companion, and at another time, a railway porter in his velveteen uniform came by. Whenever these peculiar visitors appeared, Sherlock Holmes would request the use of the sitting room, and I would retreat to my bedroom. He always apologized for the inconvenience. "I need to use this room for business," he explained, "and these people are my clients." Once more, I had the chance to ask him directly about his work, but my sense of propriety stopped me from pressing him to share his confidences. I assumed he had a strong reason for his discretion, but he soon dispelled that notion by bringing up the topic himself. It was on the 4th of March, a date I recall vividly, that I woke earlier than usual and found Sherlock Holmes still at breakfast. The landlady, accustomed to my late rising, hadn't set my place or prepared my coffee. With the unreasonable irritation common to humanity, I rang the bell and tersely indicated I was ready. Then I picked up a magazine from the table, trying to pass the time with it, while my companion quietly crunched on his toast. One of the articles had a pencil mark at the top, naturally drawing my attention to it. Its rather grandiose title was The Book of Life, and it aimed to demonstrate how much an observant person could discern through a meticulous and systematic examination of everything encountered. It struck me as a curious blend of insight and absurdity. The reasoning was sharp and intense, yet the conclusions seemed to me to be overreaching and exaggerated. The author claimed that with just a fleeting expression, a twitch of a muscle or a glance of an eye, one could delve into a person's deepest thoughts. According to him, deceit was impossible for someone trained in observation and analysis. His conclusions were as certain as mathematical proofs. To those unfamiliar with his methods, his results would seem so astonishing that they might consider him a magician until they understood the processes he used to reach them. From a single drop of water, the writer asserted, a logician could infer the existence of an Atlantic or a Niagara without having seen or heard of either. Thus, all life is a vast chain, the nature of which is revealed whenever we are shown a single link. Like all other arts, the science of deduction and analysis is one that can only be mastered through long and patient study, and life is not long enough for anyone to achieve its highest perfection. Before tackling the moral and mental aspects, which present the greatest challenges, let the seeker begin by mastering simpler problems. Let him, upon meeting another person, learn at a glance to discern the individual's history and the trade or profession to which they belong. Though it may seem childish, such an exercise hones one's powers of observation, teaching where to look and what to seek. A man's profession is clearly revealed by his fingernails, his coat sleeve, His boots, the knees of his trousers, the calluses on his forefinger and thumb, his expression, and his shirt cuffs. That all these indicators combined could fail to inform a skilled observer is almost unimaginable. "What utter nonsense!" I exclaimed, slamming the magazine onto the table. "I've never read such drivel in my life." "What is it?" Sherlock Holmes inquired. "This article," I replied, gesturing at it with my egg spoon as I settled down for breakfast. "I see you've read it, given that you've marked it. I won't deny it's cleverly written, but it annoys me. It's clearly the theory of some armchair philosopher who concocts these tidy little paradoxes in the comfort of his study. It's impractical. I'd like to see him placed in a third-class carriage on the Underground and asked to deduce the occupations of all his fellow passengers. I'd bet 1,000 to 1 against him." "You'd be wasting your money," Sherlock Holmes said with a serene confidence. "As for the article, I penned it myself." "You did?" "Indeed, I have a knack for both observation and deduction. The theories I've laid out there, which you find so fantastical, are actually quite practical, so much so that I rely on them for my livelihood." "And how is that?" I asked, unable to hold back my curiosity. "Well, I have a unique profession. I believe I'm the only one of my kind. I'm a consulting detective, if you can grasp what that means. Here in London, we have plenty of government detectives and private ones. When they hit a dead end, they come to me, and I usually manage to steer them in the right direction. They present all the evidence to me, and with my extensive knowledge of criminal history, I can typically set them straight. There's a certain pattern to crimes, and if you have the details of 1,000 cases at your fingertips, it's peculiar if you can't solve the 1,001st. Lestrade is a well-known detective. He recently found himself baffled by a forgery case, which is what led him to seek my help. And the others? They're mostly referred by private inquiry agencies. They are all people grappling with some issue, seeking a bit of clarity. I listen to their stories, offer my insights, and then I collect my fee." "Are you telling me," I asked, "that you can untangle a mystery from your room that others, despite seeing every detail firsthand, can't solve?" "Exactly. I have a knack for it. Occasionally a case is more intricate, and I need to get out and see things for myself. You see, I possess a wealth of specialized knowledge that I bring to bear on the problem, which makes things much easier. Those deduction principles outlined in the article you mocked are incredibly useful in my work. Observation is second nature to me. You seemed surprised when I told you during our first meeting that you had come from Afghanistan. You must have been informed." "Not at all. I knew you were from Afghanistan. Through long practice, my thoughts move so swiftly that I reach conclusions without being aware of the steps in between. But those steps are there, nonetheless." The chain of logic unfolded as follows. Here stands a gentleman with the demeanor of a military man, yet clearly of a medical profession. An army doctor, then. His complexion is darkened, suggesting recent time spent in the tropics, though his natural skin tone is lighter, as evidenced by the fair skin on his wrists. His gaunt appearance speaks of hardship and illness. His left arm is held stiffly, indicating an injury. Where might an English army doctor have faced such adversity and sustained an arm injury in the tropics? Afghanistan is the obvious answer. This entire thought process took less than a second. I then mentioned your return from Afghanistan, and you were taken aback. "It's quite straightforward when you lay it out," I replied with a smile. You remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. I never imagined such people existed outside of fiction. Sherlock Holmes stood and lit his pipe. You probably think you're flattering me by comparing me to Dupin, he remarked. In my view, Dupin was rather unimpressive. His habit of interrupting his friend's thoughts with a timely comment after a long silence is flashy, but ultimately shallow. He possessed a certain analytical brilliance, undeniably, yet he was far from the prodigy Poe seemed to envision. "Have you read Gaboriau's novels?" I inquired. "Does Lecoq match your vision of a detective?" Sherlock Holmes scoffed with a sardonic air. "Lecoq was a hopeless bungler," he retorted, his voice edged with irritation. "His only redeeming quality was his energy. That book made me physically ill. The challenge was to identify an unknown prisoner. I could have solved it in 24 hours. Lecoq took 6 months or more. It could serve as a textbook for detectives on what to avoid." I felt a surge of indignation at seeing two characters I admired dismissed so offhandedly. I moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling street. This man might be exceptionally clever, I thought to myself, but he is undeniably arrogant. "There are no crimes and no criminals these days," he complained, his tone petulant. "What is the point of having intellect in our field? I am well aware that I have the potential to make my name renowned. No one, living or dead, has devoted the same level of study and innate talent to crime detection as I have. And what's the outcome? There's no real crime to uncover, or at best, some clumsy misdeed with motives so obvious that even a Scotland Yard officer can figure it out." I found his arrogant manner irritating and decided it was best to steer the conversation elsewhere. "What do you suppose that man is up to?" I asked, gesturing toward a sturdy, plainly dressed man who was slowly making his way down the opposite side of the street, anxiously checking the building numbers. He held a large blue envelope, clearly delivering a message. "You mean the retired Marine Sergeant?" Sherlock Holmes replied. "Full of himself," I thought. "He knows I can't confirm his guess." No sooner had this thought crossed my mind than the man we were observing spotted our door number and hurriedly crossed the street. We heard a loud knock, a deep voice below, and the sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he announced, entering the room and handing the letter to my friend. Here was my chance to deflate his ego a bit. He hadn't anticipated this when he made that offhand remark. "May I inquire, young man," I said in the most amiable tone, "what line of work you're in?" "Commissionaire, sir," he replied gruffly. "Uniforms out for repairs." "And you were?" I asked, casting a slightly mischievous glance at my companion. "A sergeant, sir. Royal Marine Light Infantry, sir." No response. "Very well, sir." He snapped his heels together, raised his hand in a salute, and departed. You've been listening to Sherlock Holmes, the 221B Chronicles, an episodic audiobook presentation of Sherlock Holmes. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back with the next 2 chapters in our next release. Until then, the case continues. Welcome back to another episodic audiobook presentation of Sherlock Holmes. In this series, each chapter brings the classic tales to life, unfolding the mystery, atmosphere, and adventure that have captivated readers for generations. Before we begin, a brief note. This presentation of Sherlock Holmes is a modernized retelling of the original canon. The cases remain faithful to the stories that generations have loved, while the language and structure have been carefully refined to create a smoother, more immersive listening experience for today's audience. What you are about to hear is not a change to the mysteries themselves, but a restoration of their flow, allowing the world of Sherlock Holmes to unfold clearly for the modern ear. And now, we return to the first case, Book 1, A Study in Scarlet. Chapter 3, The Lauriston Gardens Mystery. I must admit, I was quite taken aback by this new demonstration of my companion's practical theories. My admiration for his analytical skills grew immensely. Yet a lingering doubt persisted in my mind that the entire scene might have been staged to impress me, though I couldn't fathom why he would bother. As I glanced at him, he had finished reading the note, and his eyes had taken on a vacant, dull look that indicated he was deep in thought. "How on earth did you figure that out?" I asked. "Figure out what?" he replied irritably. "Why, that he was a retired sergeant of Marines." "I have no time for trivial matters," he replied curtly, then softened with a smile. "Forgive my abruptness. You interrupted my train of thought, but perhaps that's for the best. So you really couldn't tell that man was a sergeant of Marines?" "No, not at all." "It's easier to recognize than to articulate why. If someone asked you to prove that 2 + 2 = 4, you might struggle to explain, yet you're certain of it. Even from across the street, I noticed a large blue anchor tattooed on the back of his hand. That suggested a nautical background. Yet he carried himself with a military bearing and had the regulation side whiskers. There you have the Marine. He exuded a sense of self-importance and an air of authority. Surely you noticed how he held his head and swung his cane. A steady, respectable, middle-aged man, all of which led me to conclude he was a sergeant. "Amazing!" I exclaimed. "Ordinary," said Holmes, though his expression suggested he was pleased by my evident surprise and admiration. "I mentioned earlier that there were no criminals." "It seems I might have been mistaken. Take a look at this." He tossed me the note delivered by the commissionaire. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed as I scanned it. "This is dreadful." "It does appear somewhat unusual," he replied with composure. "Would you mind reading it aloud to me? Here is the letter I read to him. My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, an unfortunate incident occurred last night at 3 Lauriston Gardens, just off Brixton Road. Our officer on patrol noticed a light there around 2 in the morning, and since the house is unoccupied, he suspected something was wrong. He found the door ajar, and in the front room, which is devoid of furniture, he discovered the body of a well-dressed gentleman. The cards in his pocket identified him as Enoch J. Drebber, Cleveland, Ohio, USA. There was no sign of robbery, nor any clue as to how the man met his end. Bloodstains were present in the room, yet there was no wound on his body. We are baffled as to how he ended up in the vacant house. Indeed, the entire situation is perplexing. If you can visit the house before noon, you'll find me there. I've left everything as it is until I hear from you. Should you be unable to come, I will provide more detailed information, and I would greatly appreciate your insights on the matter. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson. Gregson is the sharpest of the Scotland Yard detectives, my friend observed. He and Lestrade are the best of a mediocre bunch. They're both quick and energetic, but terribly conventional. They're also quite competitive with each other, like rival performers. If they both get involved in this case, it should be entertaining. I was struck by how casually he spoke. "Surely we can't waste any time," I exclaimed. "Should I call a cab for you?" "I'm not sure if I'll go. I'm the laziest person alive when the mood strikes, though I can be quite active when I choose." "But this is exactly the kind of opportunity you've been waiting for." "My dear friend, what difference does it make to me? Even if I solve the whole thing, you can bet Gregson, Lestrade, and their colleagues will take all the credit. That's the downside of being an unofficial figure. But he's asking for your help." "Yes." He knows I'm his superior and admits it to me, though he'd rather cut out his tongue than confess it to anyone else. Still, we might as well take a look. I'll figure it out on my own terms. If nothing else, I might get a laugh out of it. "Let's go." He shrugged on his overcoat, his previous apathy replaced by a burst of energy. "Grab your hat," he instructed. "You want me to come along?" "Yes, unless you have something better to do." Moments later, we were both in a hansom cab, racing down Brixton Road. The morning was foggy and overcast. A dull veil draped over the rooftops, like a reflection of the muddy streets below. My companion was in high spirits, chatting away about Cremona violins and the distinctions between a Stradivarius and an Amati. Meanwhile, I remained silent, the dreary weather and the somber nature of our task weighing on my mood. "You don't seem very focused on the matter at hand," I finally said, cutting into Holmes's musical musings. "No data yet," he replied. "It's a grave mistake to form theories before you have all the evidence. It skews the judgment." "You'll have your information soon," I said, gesturing with my hand. "This is Brixton Road, and that's the house, unless I'm very much mistaken." "Indeed it is. Stop, driver, stop." Though we were still about 100 yards away, he insisted we get out and walk the rest of the way. Number 3. Lauriston Gardens had a foreboding and threatening appearance. It was one of 4 houses set slightly back from the street, with 2 occupied and 2 vacant. The empty ones stared out with 3 rows of desolate windows, blank and cheerless, except for the occasional "To Let" sign that clung to the grimy glass like a cataract. A small garden, dotted with a sparse array of unhealthy plants, separated each house from the street. A narrow yellowish path, seemingly made of clay and gravel, cut through the garden. The entire area was soggy from the previous night's rain. A 3-foot brick wall topped with wooden rails bordered the garden, and leaning against it was a sturdy police constable, surrounded by a small group of onlookers who craned their necks and strained their eyes, hoping in vain to glimpse the activity inside. I expected Sherlock Holmes to immediately rush into the house and dive into the mystery, yet nothing seemed further from his mind. With a nonchalant air that struck me as almost affected given the circumstances, he strolled up and down the pavement, gazing idly at the ground, the sky, the houses across the street, and the line of railings. After completing his examination, he moved slowly along the path, or rather, the strip of grass beside it, his gaze fixed intently on the ground. Twice he paused, and once I noticed a smile cross his face, accompanied by a satisfied exclamation. The wet, clay-rich soil bore numerous footprints, yet with the police traipsing back and forth, I couldn't fathom how he expected to glean any useful information. Still, given the remarkable demonstrations of his perceptive abilities I'd witnessed, I had no doubt he could discern much that eluded me. At the entrance of the house, we were greeted by a tall, pale man with flaxen hair, clutching a notebook. He hurried forward and shook my companion's hand with enthusiasm. "It's truly generous of you to come," he said. I've ensured everything remains untouched." "Except that," my friend replied, gesturing toward the path. "A stampede of buffalo couldn't have made a bigger mess. I trust, however, that you formed your conclusions, Gregson, before allowing this." "I've been preoccupied with matters inside the house," the detective responded evasively. "My colleague, Mr. Lestrade, is here. I had depended on him to handle this matter." Holmes glanced at me, raising his eyebrows with a sardonic twist. "With two capable men like you and Lestrade on the scene, there won't be much left for anyone else to uncover," he remarked. Gregson rubbed his hands together with a self-satisfied air. "I believe we've done everything possible," he replied. "It's an odd case, though, and I knew it would pique your interest." "You didn't arrive here by cab, did you?" Sherlock Holmes inquired. "No, sir." "Nor did Lestrade?" "No, sir." "Then let's go examine the room," he said, making this seemingly offhand comment as he strode into the house, followed by Gregson, whose face showed his surprise. A short, bare and dusty hallway led to the kitchen and other service areas. Two doors opened off it, one to the left and one to the right. One of these doors had clearly been shut for many weeks. The other led to the dining room, the very place where the mysterious incident had taken place. Holmes entered, and I followed, feeling that subdued heaviness in my heart that the presence of death always brings. It was a large square room, appearing even more expansive due to the complete lack of furniture. The walls were covered in garish wallpaper, though it was marred in spots by mildew, and here and there, large strips had peeled away, revealing the yellow plaster beneath. Directly across from the door stood a flashy fireplace, topped with a mantelpiece made to look like white marble. In one corner of it was the stub of a red wax candle. The lone window was so filthy that the light filtering through was dim and uncertain, casting a dull grey hue over everything, further deepened by the thick layer of dust that blanketed the entire room. I took in all these details later. At that moment, my focus was fixed on the single grim, unmoving figure stretched out on the floorboards, its vacant, lifeless eyes staring up at the stained ceiling. It was a man, perhaps 43 or 44 years old, of average height, broad-shouldered, with tightly curled black hair and a short, bristly beard. He wore a heavy broadcloth frock coat and waistcoat, light-coloured trousers, and a pristine collar and cuffs. A well-brushed top hat lay on the floor beside him. His hands were clenched, his arms flung wide, and his legs were entangled as if his final struggle had been a fierce one. On his rigid face was an expression of horror, and it seemed to me, of hatred, unlike anything I had ever seen on a human face. This malignant and terrifying grimace, combined with his low forehead, blunt nose and jutting jaw, gave the deceased an oddly simian, ape-like appearance, which was heightened by his twisted, unnatural posture. I've encountered death in countless guises, yet never has it struck me with such dread as it did in that dim, grimy room overlooking one of the bustling veins of suburban London. Lestrade, as wiry and sharp-eyed as ever, stood by the door, acknowledging my companion and me with a nod. "This case is going to cause quite a stir, sir," he remarked. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen, and I've been around the block." "No leads?" Gregson inquired. "None whatsoever," Lestrade confirmed. Sherlock Holmes moved to the body, kneeling to scrutinize it closely. "You're certain there's no wound?" he asked, gesturing to the many droplets and splashes of blood scattered around. Absolutely, both detectives exclaimed. Then this blood must belong to another person, likely the perpetrator, assuming a murder has occurred. It reminds me of the Van Jansen case in Utrecht back in '34. Do you recall that one, Gregson? No, sir. You should look it up. It's worth your attention. There is nothing new under the sun. Everything has been done before. As he spoke, his agile fingers darted everywhere, feeling, pressing, unbuttoning, examining, while his eyes held that distant look I had already noted. The examination was so swift that one might not have guessed its thoroughness. Finally, he sniffed the dead man's lips and glanced at the soles of his patent leather shoes. He hasn't been moved at all, he asked. Only as much as was necessary for our examination. You can take him to the mortuary now, he said. There's nothing more to be learned. Gregson had a stretcher and 4 men ready. At his signal, they entered the room, lifted the stranger, and carried him out. As they raised him, a ring clattered to the floor and rolled away. Lestrade snatched it up, staring at it with puzzled eyes. A woman has been here, he exclaimed. It's a woman's wedding ring. He held it out on the palm of his hand as he spoke. We all gathered around him, our eyes fixed on the object. There was no mistaking it. A simple gold band that had once graced a bride's finger. This makes things more complicated, Gregson remarked, as if they weren't tangled enough already. Are you certain it doesn't actually simplify them? Holmes interjected. Staring at it won't reveal anything new. What did you find in his pockets? We've got everything here, Gregson replied, gesturing to a collection of items scattered on one of the lower steps of the staircase. A gold watch, number 97,163, by Barraud of London. A heavy, solid gold Albert chain. A gold ring with a Masonic emblem. A gold pin shaped like a bulldog's head, with ruby eyes. A Russian leather card case containing cards for Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland, matching the EJD on the linen. No wallet, but loose change amounting to £7.13. A pocket edition of Boccaccio's Decameron was found, with Joseph Stangerson's name inscribed on the flyleaf. There were also 2 letters, one addressed to E.J. Drebber, and the other to Joseph Stangerson. What was the address on them? American Exchange, Strand, to be held until collected. Both letters are from the Guion Steamship Company, discussing the departure of their ships from Liverpool. It seems clear that this unfortunate man was planning to return to New York. Have you looked into this man, Stangerson? I acted immediately, sir, Gregson replied. Advertisements have been placed in all the newspapers, and one of my men has gone to the American Exchange, though he hasn't reported back yet. Have you contacted Cleveland? We sent a telegram this morning. What did you ask? We outlined the situation and requested any information that might assist us. You didn't ask for details on any particular point that seemed crucial? I inquired about Stangerson. Nothing else. Is there no specific detail upon which this entire case seems to depend? Won't you send another telegram? I've said everything I need to, Gregson replied, his tone tinged with irritation. Sherlock Holmes chuckled softly, seemingly on the verge of a comment, when Lestrade, who had been in the front room while we conversed in the hallway, re-entered with a self-satisfied air, rubbing his hands together. Mr. Gregson, he announced, I've just uncovered something of utmost importance, something that would have been missed without my thorough examination of the walls. His eyes gleamed with excitement, clearly pleased to have gained an advantage over his colleague. "Come here," he urged, bustling back into the room, which felt lighter now that its grim occupant was gone. "Stand right there!" He struck a match against his boot and held it up to the wall. "Look at that!" he declared triumphantly. I had noticed that the wallpaper had peeled away in places. In this particular corner, a large section had come off, revealing a yellow patch of rough plaster. Scrawled across this bare surface, in blood-red letters, was a single word: Rach. "What do you make of this?" the detective exclaimed, his voice filled with the pride of a showman unveiling a spectacle. This was missed because it lay in the darkest corner of the room, a place no one thought to check. The murderer wrote it in their own blood. Look at this smear where it dripped down the wall. That rules out suicide. No doubt about it. But why choose that corner to write in? I'll tell you. See that candle on the mantelpiece? It was lit at the time. If it was burning, this corner would have been the brightest spot on the wall, not the darkest. And now that you've found it, what does it mean? Gregson asked, his tone dismissive. Mean? It means the writer intended to spell out the name Rachel, but was interrupted before finishing. Mark my words, when this case is solved, you'll find a woman named Rachel is involved. Laugh all you want, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You might be smart and clever, but when all is said and done, the old hound is still the best. I sincerely apologize, my companion exclaimed, having inadvertently irritated the small man by bursting into laughter. You definitely deserve credit for being the first among us to discover this, and as you mentioned, it unmistakably appears to have been penned by the other party involved in last night's mystery. I haven't had the chance to examine this room yet, but with your permission, I'd like to do so now. As he spoke, he swiftly produced a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket. Armed with these tools, he moved silently around the room, occasionally pausing, sometimes kneeling, and at one point lying flat on his stomach. So absorbed was he in his task that he seemed to forget we were even there, muttering to himself the entire time, a continuous stream of exclamations, groans, whistles, and small cries that hinted at encouragement and hope. Watching him, I couldn't help but be reminded of a purebred, well-trained foxhound darting back and forth through the underbrush, whining with eagerness until it picks up the lost scent. For over 20 minutes, he continued his investigation, meticulously measuring distances between marks that were completely invisible to me, occasionally applying his tape to the walls in a similarly baffling manner. At one spot, he carefully collected a small pile of grey dust from the floor and sealed it in an envelope. Finally, he scrutinized the word on the wall with his magnifying glass, examining each letter with the utmost precision. Once finished, he seemed content, returning the tape and glass to his pocket. They say genius is simply the ability to endure endless effort, he remarked with a smile. It's not the best definition, but it certainly fits detective work. Gregson and Lestrade watched their amateur colleagues' maneuvers with a mix of curiosity and a hint of disdain. They clearly didn't grasp, as I had begun to, that every small action of Sherlock Holmes was aimed at a specific, practical goal. What do you make of it, sir? They both inquired. It would be unfair to take the credit from you by offering my assistance, my friend replied. You're doing so well on your own that it would be a shame for anyone to step in. His voice dripped with sarcasm. However, if you keep me updated on your progress, he continued, I'd be glad to offer any help I can. Meanwhile, I'd like to speak with the constable who discovered the body. Could you provide his name and address? Lestrade checked his notebook. "John Rance," he said. "He's off duty now. You'll find him at 46, Audley Court, Kennington Park Gate." Holmes jotted down the address. "Let's go, Doctor," he said, beckoning me to follow. He turned to the two detectives, offering a crucial insight. A murder has occurred, and the killer is a man. He's over 6 feet tall, in his prime, with surprisingly small feet for his height. He wore coarse, square-toed boots and smoked a Trichinopoly cigar. He arrived here with the victim in a four-wheeled cab, pulled by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on its front right leg. The murderer likely has a ruddy complexion, and the fingernails on his right hand are unusually long. These clues might help you. Lestrade and Gregson exchanged skeptical glances. "If there was a murder, how was it committed?" Lestrade inquired. "Poison," Sherlock Holmes replied tersely, striding away. "One more thing, Lestrade," he added, turning back at the door. "Rach is German for revenge, so don't waste time searching for Miss Rachel." With that parting shot, he left, leaving the two detectives speechless in his wake. In Chapter 3, Watson witnesses Holmes put his deductive theories into practical action, astonishing him by casually revealing intimate details about a stranger's past. This moment cements Watson's admiration, even as he struggles to understand how such conclusions are reached so effortlessly. The chapter takes a darker turn when a letter arrives from Scotland Yard, describing a baffling death in an empty house on Brixton Road. Though outwardly indifferent, Holmes is intrigued. After some characteristic reluctance and dry humor about official recognition, he agrees to investigate, drawing Watson with him as they set out toward their first true case together. Chapter 4 marks the beginning of the investigation itself. Holmes arrives at the grim house in Lauriston Gardens, where a mysterious death has left seasoned detectives perplexed. As others focus on the obvious, Holmes quietly studies what they overlook, revealing that the true story of the crime is written not in spectacle, but in subtle traces waiting to be read. Chapter 4. What John Rance had to tell. It was 1 o'clock when we left number 3, Lauriston Gardens. Sherlock Holmes led me to the nearest telegraph office, where he sent off a lengthy telegram. He then flagged down a cab and instructed the driver to take us to the address Lestrade had provided. "There's nothing like first-hand evidence," he remarked. "To be honest, I've already made up my mind about the case, but we might as well gather all the information we can." "You astonish me, Holmes," I said. "Surely you can't be as certain as you claim about all those details you mentioned." "There's no room for error," he replied. "The very first thing I noticed when we arrived was that a cab had left 2 deep ruts with its wheels close to the curb. We haven't had rain for a week until last night, so those wheel marks must have been made during the night. There were also hoof prints, one of which was more sharply defined than the others, indicating a new shoe. Since the cab was there after the rain started, and wasn't there at any time in the morning, Gregson confirmed that it must have been there during the night, which means it brought those 2 people to the house." "That seems straightforward enough," I said. "But what about the other man's height?" "Well, you can usually determine a man's height from the length of his stride in 9 cases out of 10. It's a straightforward calculation, really, though I won't bore you with the numbers. I measured this man's stride both on the clay outside and the dust inside. Then I had a way to verify my findings. When a person writes on a wall, they naturally do so at their eye level. This writing was just over 6 feet from the ground. It was child's play." "And his age?" I inquired. "Well, If someone can stride 4.5 feet effortlessly, they're not exactly in their twilight years. That was the width of a puddle on the garden path that he clearly walked across. Patent leather shoes had gone around it, while square toes had leapt over. There's no mystery here. I'm merely applying some basic principles of observation and deduction that I discussed in that article. Is there anything else that confuses you? The fingernails and the trichinopoly, I suggested. The writing on the wall was done with a man's forefinger dipped in blood. My magnifying glass showed me that the plaster was slightly scratched in the process, which wouldn't have happened if the man's nails had been trimmed. I gathered some scattered ash from the floor. It was dark and flaky, the kind only a trichinopoly cigar leaves behind. I've made a special study of cigar ashes. In fact, I've written a monograph on the subject. I pride myself on being able to identify the ash of any known brand of cigar or tobacco at a glance. It's in these details that a skilled detective stands apart from the likes of Gregson and Lestrade. And the florid face? I inquired. That was a bolder guess, though I'm confident I was correct. You mustn't press me on that just yet. Given the current stage of the investigation, I ran my hand over my forehead. My mind is spinning, I admitted. The more I ponder it, the more perplexing it becomes. How did these two men, assuming there were two, enter an empty house? What happened to the cabman who drove them? How could one man force another to ingest poison? Where did the blood originate? What was the murderer's motive, if not robbery? And how did the woman's ring end up there? Above all, why would the second man write the German word Reich before leaving? I admit, I can't see how all these pieces fit together. My companion smiled, clearly pleased. You've captured the complexities of the situation quite well, he said. There's still much that's unclear, though I've settled on the main facts. As for Lestrade's discovery, it was merely a distraction meant to mislead the police by hinting at socialism and secret societies. It wasn't the work of a German. If you noticed, the A was printed in a style somewhat resembling the German way. However, a true German would use the Latin script, so we can confidently say this wasn't written by one, but by a clumsy imitator who overdid it. It was a simple ploy to steer the investigation off course. I won't reveal much more about the case, Doctor. You know, a magician loses his mystique once he explains his trick. And if I show you too much of my method, you might conclude that I'm just an ordinary person after all. I could never think that, I replied. You've brought the art of detection as close to a science as it will ever get in this world. My companion blushed with pleasure at my words and the sincerity with which I spoke them. I had already noticed that he was as sensitive to praise about his craft as any young woman might be about her beauty. I'll tell you something else, he said. Patent leathers and square toes arrived in the same cab, strolling down the path together, as if they were the best of friends, probably arm in arm. Once inside, they paced the room, or rather, patent leathers stayed put while square toes paced back and forth. I could see all that in the dust, and as he walked, he got more and more agitated. You can tell by the longer strides. He was talking the whole time, likely working himself into a rage. Then the tragedy happened. That's all I know for sure. The rest is just speculation. But we have a solid starting point. We need to move quickly, because I want to catch Halley's concert to hear Norman Neruda this afternoon. This conversation unfolded as our cab navigated through a maze of grimy streets and bleak alleyways. in the most dismal of them, our driver suddenly stopped. "That's Audley Court over there," he said, pointing to a narrow gap in the line of dull brick. "I'll be waiting here when you return." Audley Court was far from inviting. The narrow passage led us into a courtyard, paved with flagstones, surrounded by grimy buildings. We navigated through clusters of unkempt children and lines of faded laundry until we reached number 46, where a small brass plate bore the name Rance. Upon inquiry, we learned the constable was asleep, and we were ushered into a modest front parlour to wait for him. He soon appeared, looking somewhat annoyed at being roused from his rest. "I already filed my report at the office," he remarked. Holmes took a half-sovereign from his pocket, turning it thoughtfully in his fingers. "We thought it best to hear the details directly from you," he replied. "I'd be glad to share whatever I can," the constable said, his gaze fixed on the gleaming coin. "Please, recount it in your own words, just as it happened." Rance settled onto the horsehair sofa, furrowing his brow as if to ensure he left nothing out of his account. "I'll start from the beginning," he began. "My shift runs from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. There was a scuffle at the White Hart around 11, but aside from that, the night was uneventful. At 1, it started raining, and I ran into Harry Murcher. He covers the Holland Grove beat, and we stood chatting at the corner of Henrietta Street. Around 2 o'clock, maybe a bit later, I decided to take a walk down Brixton Road to make sure everything was in order. The place was filthy and deserted. I didn't encounter a single person, though a couple of cabs did pass by. As I strolled along, privately contemplating how nice a hot gin would be, a sudden flicker of light in the window of a familiar house caught my attention. I knew those 2 houses on Lauriston Gardens were vacant because the owner refused to fix the drains, and the last tenant had died of typhoid fever. So seeing a light there was startling, and I suspected something was amiss. When I reached the door, "You paused and then walked back to the garden gate," my companion interjected. "Why did you do that?" Rance jumped, astonished, and stared at Sherlock Holmes with utter disbelief. "Well, that's true, sir," he replied, "though how you figured that out is beyond me. You see, when I got to the door, it was so quiet and eerie that I thought having someone with me wouldn't hurt. I'm not afraid of anything in this world. But I wondered if it was the ghost of the man who died of typhoid, checking the drains, that killed him. That thought gave me a shiver, so I walked back to the gate to see if I could spot Murcher's lantern, but there was no sign of him or anyone else." "Was there no one on the street?" "Not a soul, sir, not even a stray dog." I gathered my wits and went back, pushing the door open. Everything was silent inside, so I entered the room where the light was still burning. A candle flickered on the mantelpiece, a red wax one, and by its glow I saw. "Yes, I'm aware of what you saw. You circled the room a few times, knelt by the body, then moved on to check the kitchen door, and then—" John Rance leapt to his feet, his face a mask of fear and suspicion. "Where were you hiding to see all that?" he demanded. "It seems you know far more than you should." Holmes chuckled, tossing his card across the table to the constable. "Don't go arresting me for the murder," he said. "I'm one of the hounds, not the wolf. Mr. Gregson or Mr. Lestrade can vouch for that. But continue, please. What did you do next?" Rance sat back down, though his expression remained perplexed. I returned to the gate and blew my whistle. That brought Murcher and two others to the scene. Was the street empty by then? Well, as far as anyone useful goes, it was. What do you mean? The constable's face broke into a grin. I've encountered many a drunk in my time, he said, but never anyone as outrageously drunk as that fellow. He was at the gate when I came out, leaning against the railings and singing at the top of his lungs about Columbine's newfangled banner, or some nonsense like that. He couldn't stand, let alone be of any help. What kind of man was he? Sherlock Holmes inquired. John Rance seemed a bit annoyed by this tangent. He was an exceptionally drunk sort of man, he said. He would have found himself in the station if we hadn't been so preoccupied. His face, his clothes. Didn't you notice them? Holmes interjected impatiently. Of course I noticed them, considering I had to prop him up, Murcher and I, between ours. He was a tall fellow with a red face, the lower part wrapped up. That's enough, Holmes interrupted. What happened to him? We had enough on our plate without worrying about him, the policeman grumbled, sounding put out. I'm sure he found his way home just fine. What was he wearing? A brown overcoat. Did he have a whip with him? A whip? No. He must have left it behind, my companion murmured. Did you see or hear a cab after that? No. Here's half a sovereign for you, my companion said, rising and putting on his hat. I'm afraid, Rance, you'll never advance in the force. That head of yours should be used for more than just decoration. You could have earned your sergeant's stripes last night. The man you had in your grasp is the key to this mystery, the one we're after. There's no point in arguing now. I'm telling you it's true. Come on, Doctor. We headed to the cab together, leaving our informant skeptical but visibly uneasy. The bumbling idiot, Holmes said bitterly as we drove back to our lodgings. To think he had such an incredible stroke of luck and squandered it. I'm still rather in the dark. Indeed, the description of this man aligns perfectly with your notion of the second figure in this mystery. But why would he return to the scene after leaving? That's not typical criminal behavior. The ring, my friend, the ring. That's what drew him back. If we can't catch him any other way, we can always use the ring as bait. I'll wager 2-1 that I'll catch him. I owe it all to you. Without your involvement, I might have missed the most fascinating case I've ever encountered. A study in scarlet, if you will. Why not indulge in a bit of artistic language? There's a scarlet thread of murder weaving through the otherwise colourless fabric of life, and it's our job to unravel it, isolate it, and reveal every inch. Now let's have lunch and then off to see Norman Neruda. Her technique and bowing are remarkable. What's that little Chopin piece she plays so brilliantly? Tra-la, la, lira, lira, lay. Reclining in the cab, this amateur sleuth sang like a lark while I pondered the complexity of the human mind. You've been listening to Sherlock Holmes, the 221B Chronicles, an episodic audiobook presentation of Sherlock Holmes. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back with the next 2 chapters in our next release. Until then, the case continues. Welcome back to another episodic audiobook presentation of Sherlock Holmes. In this series, each chapter brings the classic tales to life, unfolding the mystery, atmosphere, and adventure that have captivated readers for generations. Today's episode includes 3 chapters. If you're enjoying the journey, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe to stay updated with each new release. Before we begin, a brief note. This presentation of Sherlock Holmes is a modernized retelling of the original canon. The cases remain faithful to the stories that generations have loved, while the language and structure have been carefully refined to create a smoother, more immersive listening experience for today's audience. What you are about to hear is not a change to the mysteries themselves, but a restoration of their flow, allowing the world of Sherlock Holmes to unfold clearly for the modern ear. And now, we return to the first case. Book 1, A Study in Scarlet. Chapter 5. Our advertisement brings a visitor. The morning's activities had taken a toll on my fragile health, leaving me exhausted by afternoon. After Holmes left for the concert, I stretched out on the sofa, hoping for a couple of hours of sleep. But sleep eluded me. My mind was too stirred by the day's events, and it teemed with strange thoughts and speculations. Each time I closed my eyes, the grotesque, baboon-like face of the murdered man loomed before me. The sinister impression it left was so strong that I felt a reluctant gratitude towards whoever had removed him from this world. If ever a face reflected the deepest vice, it was surely that of Enoch J. Drebber from Cleveland. Yet I understood that justice must prevail, and the victim's depravity did not excuse his murder in the eyes of the law. The more I pondered, the more remarkable Holmes's theory of poisoning seemed. I recalled how he had sniffed the man's lips, undoubtedly detecting something that sparked his suspicion. But if not poison, then what had caused the man's death, given there were no wounds or signs of strangulation? And whose blood was it that pooled so thickly on the floor? There were no indications of a struggle, nor did the victim possess any weapon with which he could have injured an attacker. As long as these questions remained unanswered, I knew sleep would be elusive for both Holmes and me. His calm, assured demeanor suggested he had already devised a theory that accounted for all the facts, though I couldn't begin to guess what it might be. He returned very late. So late that I realized the concert couldn't have occupied all his time. Dinner was already on the table when he finally arrived. "It was magnificent," he said, taking his seat. "Do you recall what Darwin says about music? He argues that the ability to create and appreciate music existed in humanity long before the development of speech. Perhaps that's why it influences us so profoundly. There are faint echoes in our souls from those ancient times when the world was young." "That's quite a sweeping notion," I commented. "One's ideas must be as expansive as nature if they are to interpret it," he replied. "What's wrong? You don't seem quite yourself. This Brixton Road case has shaken you." "To be honest, it has," I admitted. "I should be more resilient after my experiences in Afghanistan. I witnessed my fellow soldiers being brutally killed at Maiwand, yet I kept my composure." "I understand. There's something about this mystery that captures the imagination. Without imagination, there is no fear. Have you seen the evening paper?" "No, I haven't. It provides a decent account of the incident. However, it omits the detail that when the man was lifted, a woman's wedding ring fell to the floor. It's probably for the best that it doesn't mention it." "Why is that?" "Take a look at this advertisement," he replied. "I had it placed in every paper this morning right after the incident." He tossed the paper to me, and I looked at the spot he indicated. It was the first listing in the found section. On Brixton Road this morning, it read, a plain gold wedding ring was found on the road between the White Hart Tavern and Holland Grove. Inquire with Dr. Watson, 221B Baker Street, between 8 and 9 this evening. Forgive me for using your name, he said. If I used my own, some of these fools would recognize it and try to interfere with the matter. That's fine, I replied. But if someone does respond, I don't have a ring. Oh, but you do, he said, handing me one. This will work perfectly. It's almost an exact match. And who do you think will respond to this ad? The man in the brown coat, our rosy-cheeked friend with the square-toed shoes. If he doesn't come himself, he'll send someone in his place. Wouldn't he find it too risky? Not at all. If my theory is correct, and I have every reason to believe it is, this man would rather take any risk than lose the ring. I suspect he dropped it while bending over Drebber's body, and didn't notice at the time. After leaving, he realized it was missing and rushed back, only to find the police already there, thanks to his own mistake of leaving the candle burning. He had to act drunk to avoid suspicion when he showed up at the gate. Now, put yourself in his shoes. As he thought it over, he must have considered that he might have lost the ring on the road after leaving the house. What would he do then? He'd eagerly scan the evening papers, hoping to see it listed among the found items. Naturally, his attention would be drawn to this. He'd be thrilled. Why would he suspect a trap? In his mind, there'd be no link between finding the ring and the murder. He would come. He will come. You'll see him within the hour. And then? I inquired. Oh, leave that to me. Do you have any weapons? I have my old service revolver and a few cartridges. You should clean it and load it. He'll be a desperate man. And even though I'll catch him off guard, it's best to be prepared for anything. I went to my room and did as he suggested. When I returned with the pistol, the table was cleared, and Holmes was absorbed in his favorite pastime, playing his violin. The plot thickens, he said as I entered. I've just received a reply to my telegram to America. My theory about the case is correct. And what is that? I asked eagerly. My violin could use new strings, he commented. Put your pistol in your pocket. When the man arrives, just talk to him normally. Leave the rest to me. Don't scare him by staring too intensely. It's 8 o'clock now, I noted, checking my watch. Yes, he should be here shortly. Open the door a bit. That's enough. Now place the key inside. Thank you. I found this peculiar old book at a stall yesterday, De Jure Inter Gentes, published in Latin in Liège, in the Lowlands, back in 1642. Charles still had his head firmly attached when this little brown-backed volume was printed. Who printed it? Philippe de Croix, whoever he was. On the flyleaf, in very faded ink, it says, Ex libris Gulielmi White. I wonder who William White was. Probably some pedantic 17th century lawyer. His handwriting has a legal flair. Here comes our man, I think. As he spoke, the doorbell rang sharply. Sherlock Holmes rose quietly and adjusted his chair toward the door. We heard the servant move down the hallway, followed by the sharp click of the latch as she opened the door. Does Dr. Watson live here? Asked a voice that was clear but somewhat grating. We couldn't catch the servant's response, But the door closed, and someone began to climb the stairs. The footsteps were uncertain and shuffled. My companion's face registered surprise as he listened. The steps approached slowly down the passage, and there was a weak knock at the door. "Come in," I called out. At my invitation, instead of the expected man of violence, a very old and wrinkled woman hobbled into the room. She seemed momentarily blinded by the sudden brightness of the light, and after dropping a curtsy, she stood, blinking at us with her bleary eyes, nervously fumbling in her pocket with shaky fingers. I glanced at my companion, whose face had taken on such a forlorn expression that it was all I could do to maintain my composure. The old woman pulled out an evening paper and pointed to our advertisement. "It's this that brought me, good gentleman," she said, dropping another curtsy. "A gold wedding ring on Brixton Road. It belongs to my girl Sally, who was married just a year ago. Her husband is a steward on a union boat, and what he'd say if he came home to find her without her ring is beyond me. Him being short-tempered at the best of times, especially when he's been drinking. If you please, she went to the circus last night with—" "Is that her ring?" I asked. "Thank the Lord," exclaimed the old woman. "Sally will be overjoyed tonight. That's the ring." "And what is your address?" I inquired, picking up a pencil. 13 Duncan Street, Houndsditch. Quite a distance from here." "The Brixton Road doesn't run between any circus and Houndsditch," Sherlock Holmes interjected sharply. The old woman turned to him, her small red-rimmed eyes scrutinizing. "The gentleman asked for my address," she replied. "Sally stays in lodgings at 3 Mayfield Place, Peckham." "And your name is—" "My name is Sawyer. Hers is Dennis, as she married Tom Dennis. A smart, tidy lad he is too, while at sea, and no steward in the company is more esteemed. But on shore, with women and liquor shops—" "Here is your ring, Mrs. Sawyer," I interrupted, following a discreet signal from Holmes. "It clearly belongs to your daughter, and I'm pleased to return it to its rightful owner." With many murmured blessings and expressions of gratitude, the old woman tucked it away in her pocket and shuffled down the stairs. As soon as she was gone, Sherlock Holmes leapt to his feet and dashed into his room. He returned moments later, wrapped in an ulster and a cravat. "I'll follow her," he said urgently. "She must be an accomplice and will lead me to him." "Wait up for me." The hall door had barely slammed shut behind our visitor before Holmes was already descending the stairs. Peering through the window, I watched her walk unsteadily along the opposite side, her pursuer trailing a short distance behind. Either his entire theory is flawed, I mused, or he's about to be led straight to the core of the mystery. There was no need for him to ask me to stay awake. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I learned the outcome of his venture. It was nearly 9 when he set out. I had no sense of how long he might be gone, but I sat resolutely, puffing on my pipe and leafing through Henri Murger's Vie de Bohème. 10 o'clock came and went, and I heard the maid's footsteps as she headed to bed. 11 struck, and the more deliberate steps of the landlady passed my door, bound for the same destination. It was almost midnight when I finally heard the sharp click of his key in the lock. The moment he entered, his expression told me he hadn't succeeded. Amusement and frustration seemed to vie for dominance until amusement won out, and he broke into a hearty laugh. "I wouldn't want the Scotland Yard fellows to know about this for anything," he exclaimed, dropping into his chair. "I've teased them so much that they'd never let me live it down. But I can laugh. because I know I'll get the better of them eventually." "What happened next?" I asked. "Well, I don't mind sharing a story at my own expense. That woman had barely walked a short distance before she started limping, clearly struggling with sore feet. Soon enough, she stopped and flagged down a passing four-wheeler. I stayed close to catch the address, though I needn't have worried. She shouted it loud enough for anyone across the street to hear. 'Take me to 13, Duncan Street, Houndsditch,' she called out. This seemed promising, I thought, and after she settled inside, I discreetly hitched a ride on the back. That's a skill every detective should master. Off we went, rattling along until we reached the specified street. I jumped off before we arrived at the door and casually strolled down the street. I watched as the cab stopped. The driver got down and opened the door, waiting expectantly. But nothing happened. By the time I reached him, he was rummaging frantically through the empty cab, cursing with a colourful array of oaths that was quite something to hear. There was no sign of the passenger, and I suspect it'll be a while before he sees his fare. When we inquired at number 13, we discovered the house belonged to a respectable paper hanger named Keswick, and no one by the name of Sawyer or Dennis had ever been heard of there. "You can't possibly mean," I exclaimed in disbelief, "that the frail, shaky old woman managed to leap from the cab while it was moving, without either you or the driver noticing?" "Old woman! My foot!" Sherlock Holmes retorted sharply. "We were the fools to be so easily deceived. It had to be a young man, agile and a masterful actor at that. The disguise was flawless. He must have realized he was being tailed and used this trick to escape. This proves the man we're pursuing isn't as isolated as I thought. He has allies willing to take risks for him. Now, Doctor, you look exhausted. Take my advice and get some rest." I was indeed feeling quite drained, so I followed his suggestion. I left Holmes sitting by the dying fire, and deep into the night, I could hear the haunting, mournful strains of his violin, knowing he was still deep in thought, unraveling the peculiar mystery he had taken on. In Chapter 5, Holmes set a clever trap, placing a fake advertisement about the missing wedding ring to draw out the man he suspects was at the crime scene. But instead of the suspect, a timid old woman arrived, only to vanish into the night after claiming the ring. Holmes, realizing too late that she was a disguised accomplice, gives chase, but is outwitted. Though the ruse failed, it confirms his theory. Their adversary is not only dangerous, but has allies and a cunning mind of his own. In the next chapter, Inspector Gregson steps into the spotlight. Eager to prove his worth, he delivers a confident theory and makes an arrest. But Holmes isn't so easily convinced. As rival detectives race for answers, the case begins to twist in unexpected directions. Chapter 6. Tobias Gregson shows what he can do. The newspapers the following day were abuzz with what they called the Brixton Mystery. Each carried an extensive report on the incident, with some even featuring editorials about it. I came across some details that were new to me. In my scrapbook, I still keep numerous clippings and extracts related to the case. Here's a distilled version of a few of them. The Daily Telegraph noted that in the annals of crime, few tragedies have displayed such peculiar characteristics. The victim's German name, the lack of any other apparent motive, and the ominous message scrawled on the wall all suggested the involvement of political refugees and revolutionaries. Socialists had many factions in America, and it seemed the deceased had violated their unwritten rules and was hunted down by them. The article, with a touch of levity, referenced the Vemgericht, Aqua Tofana, the Carbonari, the Marchioness de Brinvilliers, the Darwinian theory, the principles of Malthus, and the Ratcliffe highway murders, before concluding with a warning to the government and a call for stricter surveillance of foreigners in England. The Standard observed that such lawless acts typically occurred under a liberal administration. They were attributed to the disturbance of the public's mindset and the resulting erosion of authority. The deceased was an American gentleman who had been living in the city for several weeks. He had been staying at Madame Charpentier's boarding house on Torquay Terrace, Camberwell, and was travelling with his private secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson. On Tuesday the 4th, the two men bid farewell to their landlady and set off for Euston Station, claiming they intended to catch the express train to Liverpool. They were last seen together on the platform. After that, nothing more was known until Mr. Drebber's body was found in an empty house on Brixton Road, far from Euston. How he ended up there, and the circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery. Stangerson's whereabouts are still unknown. We are pleased to report that Mr. Lestrade and Mr. Gregson from Scotland Yard are on the case, and there is strong confidence that these esteemed detectives will soon shed light on the situation. The Daily News noted that the crime was undoubtedly political. The oppressive regimes and their disdain for liberalism on the continent had driven many individuals to our shores, people who might have been exemplary citizens if not embittered by their past experiences. Among these exiles, there existed a strict code of honour, violations of which were punishable by death. It is crucial to locate the secretary, Stangerson, and gather details about the deceased's lifestyle. A significant breakthrough was achieved with the discovery of the address where he had been staying, a result entirely credited to the sharpness and diligence of Mr. Gregson from Scotland Yard. Sherlock Holmes and I perused the morning notices together over breakfast, and they seemed to provide him with a good deal of amusement. I told you, no matter the outcome, Lestrade and Gregson would claim success. That depends on the result. Oh, it hardly matters. If the culprit is apprehended, it will be due to their efforts. If he escapes, it will be despite them. It's a win-win for them. Whatever happens, they'll have their admirers. A fool always finds a greater fool to admire him. "What on earth is happening?" I exclaimed, as the sound of many footsteps echoed in the hall and on the stairs, accompanied by our landlady's audible expressions of disapproval. "It's the Baker Street Division of the Detective Police Force," my companion said gravely. As he spoke, half a dozen of the dirtiest and most ragged street urchins I'd ever seen burst into the room. "Attention!" Holmes barked sharply, and the 6 grimy little rascals lined up like a row of disreputable statuettes. "From now on, Wiggins will report alone, and the rest of you must wait outside. Have you found it, Wiggins?" "No, sir, we haven't," one of the young lads replied. "I didn't really think you would. Keep at it until you do. Here are your wages." He handed each of them a shilling. "Now, off you go, and bring back a better report next time." He waved them off, and they dashed downstairs like a pack of rats, their high-pitched voices echoing in the street moments later. "You can get more work out of one of those little rascals than from a dozen officers," Holmes observed. "The mere presence of someone official-looking makes people clam up. These kids, though, they go everywhere and hear everything. They're sharp as needles. All they need is a bit of organization." "Are you using them for this Brixton case?" I inquired. "Yes, there's something I need to find out. It's just a matter of time. We're about to get some news now, and in a big way. Here comes Gregson down the road, looking positively radiant. He's headed our way, I'm sure." "Yes, he's stopping. There he is." A sharp ring echoed through the house, and moments later, The fair-haired detective bounded up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, and burst into our sitting room. "My dear fellow," he exclaimed, shaking Holmes's unresponsive hand with enthusiasm, "congratulate me. I've made everything as clear as day." I noticed a flicker of concern pass over my companion's expressive face. "Do you mean you're on the right track?" he inquired. "The right track? Why? We've got the man locked up," Gregson declared with pomp, rubbing his hands together and puffing out his chest. "What's his name?" Holmes asked. "Arthur Charpentier, sub-lieutenant in Her Majesty's Navy," Gregson announced, his voice swelling with pride. Sherlock Holmes sighed with relief and allowed a smile to form. "Take a seat and try one of these cigars," he offered. "We're eager to hear how you accomplished it. Would you like some whiskey and water?" "I wouldn't mind," the detective replied. "The intense effort of the past couple of days has worn me out. Not so much physically, you understand, but the mental strain has been considerable." "You'll understand, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, since we're both engaged in cerebral pursuits." "You flatter me," Holmes replied with a serious nod. "Please, share how you reached this most satisfying conclusion." The detective settled into the armchair, exhaling contentedly on his cigar. Suddenly, he slapped his thigh, overcome with amusement. "The best part," he exclaimed, "is that fool Lestrade, who fancies himself so clever, is chasing the wrong lead entirely. He's after the secretary, Stangerson, who is as innocent as a newborn. I'm sure he's already apprehended him by now." The thought amused Gregson so much that he laughed until he nearly choked. "And how did you uncover your clue?" I'll explain everything. Of course, Dr. Watson, this is strictly confidential. Our initial challenge was tracing this American's background. Some might have waited for responses to their ads, or for people to come forward with information. That's not how Tobias Gregson operates. Do you recall the hat found beside the deceased? "Yes," Holmes affirmed. "From John Underwood and Sons, 129 Camberwell Road." Gregson appeared deflated. "I didn't realize you caught that," he admitted. "Have you visited them?" "No." "Ah," Gregson exclaimed, visibly relieved. "You should never overlook any opportunity, no matter how insignificant it seems." "To a great mind, nothing is insignificant," Holmes replied with a touch of gravitas. "Well, I went to Underwood and inquired if they had sold a hat matching that size and description. He checked his records and found it immediately. The hat had been sent to a Mr. Drebber, who was staying at Charpentier's boarding establishment on Torquay Terrace. That's how I got his address." "Smart! Very smart!" Sherlock Holmes murmured. "I then visited Madame Charpentier," the detective continued. "She seemed very pale and troubled. Her daughter was there as well, a remarkably striking young woman. Her eyes were red and her lips quivered as I spoke to her. I didn't miss that. I began to suspect something was amiss. You know the sensation, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, when you catch the right trail, a kind of electric thrill running through your nerves. Have you heard about the mysterious death of your former tenant, Mr. Enoch J. Drebber from Cleveland?" I inquired. The mother nodded, seemingly unable to speak. The daughter broke into tears. It became increasingly clear to me that these people were hiding something about the incident. "What time did Mr. Drebber leave your house to catch the train?" I asked. "At 8 o'clock, she replied, swallowing hard to suppress her distress. "His secretary, Mr. Stangerson, mentioned there were 2 trains, one at 9:15 and another at 11. He was supposed to take the first. And was that the last time you saw him? As I posed the question, a dreadful transformation swept over the woman's face. Her features turned ashen. It took several seconds before she could utter the single word, yes, and when she did, it was in a hoarse, unnatural voice. There was a brief silence. Then the daughter spoke in a calm, clear voice. "No good can ever come from deceit, mother," she said. "We should be honest with this gentleman. We did see Mr. Drebber again." "God forgive you," cried Madame Charpentier, throwing her hands up and collapsing into her chair. "You've doomed your brother." "Arthur would prefer we tell the truth," the girl replied with determination. "You'd better tell me everything now," I said. "Half-truths are worse than none. Besides, you don't know how much we already know." "On your head be it, Alice," her mother exclaimed, then turned to me. "I will tell you everything, sir. Don't think my distress for my son stems from any fear that he was involved in this dreadful affair. He is completely innocent. My fear is that, in your eyes and others, he might seem implicated. But that must be impossible. His good character, his profession, his history would all prevent it." "The best course is to be completely honest," I replied. "Trust me, if your son is innocent, he will not suffer for it." "Perhaps, Alice, it would be best if you left us alone," she said, and her daughter quietly exited the room. "Now, sir," she continued, "I hadn't planned on revealing all this to you. But since my poor daughter has let it slip, I have no choice. Having decided to speak, I will tell you everything without leaving out any details." "That is the wisest decision," I replied. "Mr. Drebber has been staying with us for nearly 3 weeks. He and his secretary, Mr. Stangerson, had been travelling across Europe. I noticed a Copenhagen label on each of their suitcases, indicating that was their last stop. Stangerson was a quiet, reserved man, but his employer, I regret to say, was quite the opposite. He was coarse and brutish in his behaviour. On the very night he arrived, he drank excessively, an afternoon each day. He was rarely sober. His behaviour towards the maidservants was disgustingly familiar and inappropriate. Worst of all, he soon adopted the same demeanour towards my daughter Alice, speaking to her in ways that, thankfully, she was too innocent to comprehend. On one occasion he even grabbed her and embraced her, an outrage that prompted his own secretary to reprimand him for his disgraceful conduct. "But why did you tolerate all this?" I asked. "I assume you can dismiss your tenants whenever you choose." Mrs. Charpentier flushed at my direct question. "I wish I had told him to leave the very day he arrived," she confessed. "But it was a difficult temptation. They were paying £1 a day each, £14 a week, and this is the slow season. I'm a widow, and my son in the Navy has been expensive. I hated to lose the income. I thought I was doing the right thing. But the last incident was too much, and I finally gave him notice to leave because of it. That's why he left. And then, my heart felt lighter when I saw him drive away. My son is home on leave right now, but I didn't tell him any of this, as he has a fierce temper and is very protective of his sister. When I closed the door behind them, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my mind. Unfortunately, less than an hour later, the doorbell rang, and I discovered Mr. Drebber had returned. He was visibly agitated and clearly intoxicated. He barged into the room where I was sitting with my daughter and mumbled something incoherent about missing his train. He then turned to Alice and, right in front of me, asked her to run away with him. "You're of age," he said, "and nothing can legally stop you. I've got more than enough money. Forget about the old woman here. Just come with me right now. You'll live like royalty." Poor Alice was so scared she recoiled from him, but he grabbed her wrist and tried to pull her towards the door. I screamed, and at that moment my son Arthur entered the room. What happened next? I can't say. I heard curses and the chaotic sounds of a struggle. I was too terrified to lift my head. When I finally looked up, I saw Arthur standing in the doorway, laughing, with a stick in his hand. "I don't think that scoundrel will bother us again," he said. "I'll just follow him and see what he gets up to." With that, he grabbed his hat and headed down the street. The next morning, we heard about Mr. Drebber's mysterious death. Mrs. Charpentier spoke with many interruptions, her voice often so faint that I struggled to catch her words. Nevertheless, I took shorthand notes to ensure there would be no room for error. "Quite thrilling," Sherlock Holmes remarked with a yawn. What followed? When Mrs. Charpentier paused, the detective continued, "I realized the entire case hinged on a single detail." Locking eyes with her, a technique I've found particularly effective with women, I asked her what time her son returned home. "I don't know," she replied. "You don't know?" "No, he has a latchkey and let himself in." "After you went to bed?" "Yes." "When did you retire for the night?" "Around 11. "So your son was out for at least 2 hours?" "Yes." "Possibly 4 or 5? "Yes." "What was he doing during that time?" "I don't know," she replied, her face turning pale as her lips. After that, there was nothing more to be done. I located Lieutenant Charpentier, took 2 officers with me, and arrested him. When I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him to come quietly, he responded with surprising boldness. "I suppose you're arresting me for being involved in that scoundrel Drebber's death," he said. We hadn't mentioned anything about it to him, so his reference to it seemed highly suspicious. "Very," Holmes remarked. He still carried the heavy stick his mother had described, the one he had with him when he followed Drebber. It was a sturdy oak cudgel. "So, what's your theory?" "My theory is that he followed Drebber to Brixton Road. There, another argument broke out between them, during which Drebber received a blow from the stick, perhaps in the stomach, that killed him without leaving a mark. The night was so rainy that no one was around, so Charpentier dragged the body into the empty house. As for the candle, the blood, the writing on the wall, and the ring, they could all be tricks to mislead the police." "Well done," Holmes said, his voice warm with encouragement. "Truly, Gregson, you're making progress. We'll turn you into something remarkable yet." "I must say I've handled it quite deftly," the detective replied with pride. The young man offered a statement, claiming that after trailing Drebber for a while, Drebber noticed him and took a cab to escape. On his way home, he ran into an old shipmate and went for a long walk with him. When asked where this shipmate lived, he couldn't provide a satisfactory answer. I believe the pieces of the case fit together remarkably well. What tickles me is imagining Lestrade, who set off on the wrong track. I'm afraid he won't get far with it. Why, by Jove, here he is now. Indeed, it was Lestrade who had climbed the stairs during our conversation and now entered the room. The usual confidence and flair in his demeanour and attire were conspicuously absent. His face was troubled, his clothes dishevelled. Clearly, he intended to consult Sherlock Holmes, for upon seeing his colleague, he seemed embarrassed and uneasy. He stood in the middle of the room, nervously fiddling with his hat, unsure of his next move. "This is an utterly extraordinary case," he finally said. "A truly baffling affair." "Ah, you see it that way too, Mr. Lestrade," Gregson exclaimed with a note of triumph. "I suspected you'd reached that conclusion. Have you located the secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson?" "The secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson," Lestrade replied with gravity, "was murdered at Halliday's private hotel around 6 this morning." In Chapter 6, Inspector Gregson bursts in with pride, claiming to have solved the Brixton Road mystery. Through diligent legwork, he tracks the victim, Enoch Drebber, to a London boarding house, where tensions had flared between Drebber and the landlady's daughter. Her brother, Arthur Charpentier, is arrested after Gregson pieces together a plausible motive and timeline, one that seems to fit the facts. But while Gregson basks in his moment, Holmes remains quietly unconvinced. Something doesn't add up. And just as Gregson declares victory, Inspector Lestrade arrives, pale, dishevelled, and with a stunning revelation that shatters Gregson's theory entirely. Chapter 7. Light in the Darkness. The news Lestrade delivered was so significant and unexpected that it left all three of us stunned. Gregson leapt from his chair, spilling what remained of his whiskey and water. I stared silently at Sherlock Holmes, whose lips were tightly pressed and brows furrowed in concentration. "Stangerson too," he murmured. "The plot thickens." "It was already dense enough," Lestrade grumbled, settling into a chair. "I feel like I've stumbled into some kind of war council." Are you certain about this information?" Gregson stammered. "I've just come from his room," Lestrade replied. "I was the first to discover what happened." "We've been hearing Gregson's perspective on the matter," Holmes noted. "Would you mind sharing what you've seen and done?" "I have no objection," Lestrade said, taking a seat. "I must admit, I initially believed Stangerson was involved in Drebber's death. This new development has shown me I was completely wrong. Focused on that idea, I set out to find what happened to the secretary. They were last seen together at Euston Station around 8:30 on the evening of the 3rd. By 2 in the morning, Drebber was found on Brixton Road. The challenge was to determine how Stangerson spent his time between 8:30 and the crime, and what became of him afterward. I sent a telegram to Liverpool with his description, advising them to monitor the American ships. Then I began visiting all the hotels and lodging houses near Euston. My reasoning was that if Drebber and his companion had parted ways, the latter would likely find a place to stay nearby for the night and return to the station the next morning. "They would probably agree on a meeting place beforehand," Holmes remarked. "Indeed, that's how it unfolded. I spent all of last evening making inquiries, but they led nowhere. This morning I started early, and by 8 o'clock I arrived at Halliday's private hotel on Little George Street. When I asked if a Mr. Stangerson was staying there, they immediately confirmed it. 'You must be the gentleman he's been expecting,' they said. 'He's been waiting for someone for 2 days.' 'Where is he now?' I inquired. 'He's upstairs in bed. He asked to be woken at 9. "I'll go up and see him right away," I replied. I thought my unexpected arrival might unsettle him, and cause him to say something without thinking. The hotel porter offered to show me to the room. It was on the second floor, with a narrow corridor leading to it. The porter pointed out the door and was about to head back downstairs when I noticed something that turned my stomach, despite my 2 decades of experience. A thin red ribbon of blood was seeping from under the door, winding across the passage and pooling along the baseboard on the opposite side. I cried out, which brought the porter back. He nearly fainted at the sight. The door was locked from the inside, but we forced it open with our shoulders. The window in the room stood ajar, and beside it, crumpled on the floor, lay the body of a man in his nightclothes. He was unmistakably dead, and had been for some time. His limbs were stiff and cold. When we turned him over, the boots immediately recognized him as the gentleman who had rented the room under the name Joseph Stangerson. The cause of death was a deep stab wound on the left side, likely piercing the heart. And now we come to the most peculiar aspect of the case. What do you think was above the murdered man? Even before Sherlock Holmes replied, I felt a chill run through me, a foreboding of the horror to come. The word rage, written in letters of blood, he said. That's right, Lestrade confirmed, his voice filled with awe. And we all fell silent for a moment. There was something so calculated and yet so baffling about the actions of this unknown killer that it added a new layer of dread to his crimes. My nerves, which had held steady even in battle, tingled at the thought. The man was seen, Lestrade continued. A milk boy, on his way to the dairy, happened to walk down the lane that runs from the mews behind the hotel. He noticed a ladder, typically resting on the ground, now propped against a second-floor window, which stood wide open. As he walked past, he glanced back and observed a man descending the ladder. The man moved so quietly and openly that the boy assumed he was a carpenter or joiner working at the hotel. He didn't pay much attention, merely thinking it was an early hour for such work. He recalls the man being tall, with a reddish face, and wearing a long brownish coat. The man must have lingered in the room for a while after the murder, as they found blood-stained water in the basin where he had washed his hands, and marks on the sheets where he had wiped his knife deliberately. I looked at Holmes as I heard the description of the murderer, which matched his own so precisely. Yet there was no sign of triumph or satisfaction on his face. "Did you find anything in the room that could lead us to the murderer?" he inquired. "Nothing." Stangerson had Drebber's purse in his pocket, but that seemed normal since he handled all the payments. There were over £80 in it, but nothing was missing. Whatever the motives behind these extraordinary crimes, robbery is certainly not one of them. There were no papers or notes in the murdered man's pockets, save for a lone telegram dated from Cleveland about a month prior, which simply read, "J.H. is in Europe." The message bore no signature. "And nothing else?" Holmes inquired. "Nothing of significance." The man had a novel, which he had evidently been reading before falling asleep, lying on the bed. His pipe rested on a chair beside him. A glass of water was on the table, and on the windowsill sat a small ointment box containing a couple of pills. Sherlock Holmes leapt from his chair with a cry of triumph. "The final piece," he exclaimed jubilant. "My case is complete." The two detectives looked at him, astonished. "I now hold," my companion declared with assurance, "all the threads that have been so entangled. There are, naturally, details to be filled in, but I am as certain of the main event. From when Drebber parted ways with Stangerson at the station to the discovery of Stangerson's body, as if I had witnessed them myself. I will demonstrate my understanding. Could you produce those pills? I have them, Lestrade replied, pulling out a small white box. I took them, along with the purse and the telegram, intending to secure them at the police station. It was sheer coincidence that I ended up with these pills, as I must admit, I don't really think much of them. Let me see them, said Holmes. Now, Doctor. He turned to me. Are these ordinary pills? They were anything but ordinary. They were a pearly grey, small, round, and nearly see-through when held up to the light. Given their lightness and transparency, I'd guess they're water-soluble, I observed. Exactly, Holmes replied. Now, could you go and bring up that poor little terrier that's been suffering for so long? The one the landlady asked you to put out of its misery yesterday? I went downstairs and gently carried the dog back up. Its laboured breathing and glazed eyes made it clear it was near the end. Its snow-white muzzle showed it had already outlived the typical lifespan for a dog. I set it down on a cushion by the rug. I'll cut one of these pills in half now, said Holmes, pulling out his penknife and doing just that. One half goes back in the box for later. The other half I'll place in this wineglass with a teaspoon of water. You see, our friend the doctor was right. It dissolves easily. This might be quite intriguing, Lestrade remarked, his voice tinged with the irritation of someone who feels mocked. Yet I fail to see how it relates to Mr. Joseph Stangerson's death. Patience, my dear friend. Patience. In due time, you'll realize it has everything to do with it. Now, I'll add a bit of milk to make the concoction more appealing. And when we offer it to the dog, you'll see he drinks it eagerly. As he spoke, Holmes poured the contents of the wineglass into a saucer and set it before the terrier, who promptly licked it clean. Holmes's serious demeanour had convinced us to sit silently, watching the animal closely, anticipating some dramatic reaction. Yet, nothing happened. The dog remained sprawled on the cushion, breathing heavily, but seemingly unaffected by the drink. Holmes checked his watch, and as the minutes ticked by without any change, his face showed deep frustration and disappointment. He bit his lip, tapped his fingers on the table, and exhibited every sign of intense impatience. His agitation was so palpable that I genuinely felt sorry for him, while the two detectives smirked, clearly enjoying his setback. It can't be mere coincidence, he exclaimed, finally leaping from his chair and pacing the room in agitation. It's impossible that this is just a coincidence. The very pills I suspected in Drebber's case are indeed found after Stangerson's death, and yet they remain inert. What could this possibly mean? Surely my entire line of reasoning can't be flawed. It's unthinkable. And yet, this poor dog shows no ill effects. Ah, I've got it. I've got it. With a triumphant cry, he dashed to the box, split the other pill in two, dissolved it, mixed it with milk, and offered it to the terrier. The unfortunate animal barely touched it with its tongue before it convulsed violently, every limb shuddering, and then lay still and lifeless, as if struck by lightning. Sherlock Holmes exhaled deeply, wiping sweat from his brow. I should have more faith, he remarked. By now I ought to realize that when a fact seems to contradict a long chain of deductions, it invariably can be interpreted another way. Of the two pills in that box, one was lethally poisonous, while the other was completely harmless. I should have known that before I even laid eyes on the box. This revelation was so astonishing to me that I could scarcely believe he was in his right mind. Yet, the dead dog was undeniable proof that his hypothesis was correct. It felt as though the fog in my own mind was slowly lifting, and I began to perceive the truth, albeit dimly and vaguely. "All this seems strange to you," Holmes continued, "because at the outset of the investigation, you failed to grasp the significance of the single real clue that was right in front of you. I was fortunate to latch onto that insight, and everything since has only reinforced my initial theory, following logically from it. What has puzzled you and clouded the case has actually clarified things for me and solidified my conclusions. It's a mistake to confuse the unusual with the mysterious. Often, the most ordinary crime is the most enigmatic because it lacks distinctive features from which to draw conclusions. This murder would have been far harder to solve if the victim's body had simply been found lying in the street, devoid of those bizarre and sensational elements that made it stand out. These peculiar details, rather than complicating the case, have actually simplified it. Mr. Gregson, who had been listening with growing impatience, could hold back no longer. "Listen, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said. "We all recognize that you're a clever man with your own way of doing things, but we need more than just theories and lectures now. It's time to catch the culprit. I thought I had my case wrapped up, but it turns out I was mistaken. Young Charpentier couldn't have been involved in this second incident. Lestrade pursued Stangerson, but it seems he was mistaken as well. You've been dropping hints here and there, suggesting you know more than we do. The time has come for us to ask directly, how much do you really know about this case? Can you identify the culprit?" "I can't shake the feeling that Gregson is correct, sir," Lestrade interjected. "We've both made attempts and come up short. You've mentioned more than once since I've been here that you possess all the evidence you need. Surely you won't keep it from us any longer." "Any delay in apprehending the murderer," I pointed out, "might allow him the opportunity to commit another heinous act." Pressed by all of us, Holmes showed signs of hesitation. He continued pacing the room, head bowed and brows furrowed, as he often did when deep in thought. "There will be no further murders," he finally declared, stopping abruptly and facing us. "You can dismiss that concern. You've asked if I know the assassin's name. I do. Knowing his name is a minor victory compared to actually getting our hands on him. I expect to accomplish this soon. I have a plan in place, but it requires a delicate touch. We're dealing with a sharp and dangerous man, backed by someone equally cunning. As long as he remains unaware that anyone is onto him, we have a chance to catch him. But if he even suspects, he'll change his identity and disappear into the city's 4 million souls. I mean, no offense, but I believe these men outmatch the official force, which is why I haven't sought your help. If I fail, I'll accept the blame for that decision, but I'm prepared for it. I promise to contact you the moment I can do so without jeopardizing my strategy." Gregson and Lestrade were clearly not pleased with this explanation or the slight against the detective police. Gregson flushed to the roots of his blonde hair, while Lestrade's eyes shone with a mix of curiosity and irritation. Before either could respond, there was a knock at the door, and young Wiggins, the leader of the street urchins, made his unremarkable and somewhat grimy entrance. "Please, sir," he said, touching his forelock, "I've got the cab downstairs." "Good boy," Holmes said with a calm demeanor. "Why not introduce this design at Scotland Yard?" he continued, retrieving a pair of steel handcuffs from a drawer. "Observe how smoothly the spring operates. They lock instantly. The old design works well enough, Lestrade replied. If only we can find the right man to put them on. Very good, Holmes said with a smile. The cabman might as well help me with my luggage. Wiggins, please ask him to come up. I was taken aback to hear my companion speaking as if he were preparing for a trip, as he hadn't mentioned anything to me about it. A small suitcase was in the room, which he pulled out and began to fasten. He was engrossed in this task when the cabman entered. Could you help me with this buckle, cabman? Holmes asked, focused on his work and not turning his head. The man approached with a somewhat sullen, defiant expression, reaching out to assist. In that instant, there was a sharp click, the clatter of metal, and Sherlock Holmes leapt to his feet. Gentlemen, he announced, his eyes alight, allow me to introduce Mr. Jefferson Hope, the murderer of Enoch Drebber and Joseph Stangerson. The entire scene unfolded in a flash, so swiftly that I had no time to comprehend it. I vividly remember that moment. Holmes's triumphant look, the commanding tone of his voice, and the cabman's bewildered, furious expression as he stared at the handcuffs that had seemingly materialized on his wrists. For a brief moment, we were like statues frozen in time. Then, with a guttural roar of rage, the prisoner tore himself from Holmes's grip and launched himself through the window. The wood and glass shattered around him, but before he could escape, Gregson, Lestrade, and Holmes pounced on him like a pack of hounds. They dragged him back into the room, igniting a fierce struggle. His strength was astonishing, almost convulsive, as if he were in the throes of an epileptic fit. Despite his face and hands being badly cut from the glass, the blood loss did nothing to weaken his resistance. It wasn't until Lestrade managed to get a hand inside his neckcloth and half strangle him that he realized his efforts were futile. Even then, we felt no relief until we had bound his feet as securely as his hands. Exhausted and gasping for breath, we finally stood up. "We have his cab," Sherlock Holmes said. "It will do to take him to Scotland Yard." "And now, gentlemen," he said with a warm smile, "we've come to the conclusion of our little mystery. Feel free to ask me anything you'd like. I'm more than willing to provide answers." With the second murder revealed, Holmes wastes no time. As Lestrade and Gregson scramble to adjust their theories, Holmes quietly traces the final threads. Then, in a moment of calm precision, springs his trap. The man behind both killings is caught. Not through luck, but through logic. Not through force, but by following the smallest details no one else could see. In just a few steps, Holmes does what the official detectives could not. He solves the case. But even with the killer in custody, one question remains. Why? What drove a man across continents, through years of silence, to murder not once, but twice? In part 2, the story rewinds. We leave the fog of London behind and travel across the Atlantic to the deserts of the American West. There, in a land of faith, isolation, and vengeance, we uncover the hidden past that gave birth to the mystery of Lauriston Gardens. The answers lie not in the streets of London, but in the shadows of Utah. You've been listening to Sherlock Holmes, the 221B Chronicles, an episodic audiobook presentation of Sherlock Holmes. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back with the next 2 chapters in our next release. Until then, the case continues.